now we'd like to move on to session 2, if we may. Okay, so we're going to take a slight different track in session 2 today. We have presentations in regards to latency and why it matters. A couple of presentations really looking at security, recognizing the risks as well as the experience of a fragmented world within a security environment. And then also the government and regulatory entities in regards to TR143. Once again, we're lucky to have some expert panelists from Domos, Kaon, Axiros, and F-Secure with us. So let's move quickly on to session 2 and our first presenter, if I may. If you are a regular viewer of the base seminars, whether they're face-to-face or in person, Magnus is somebody that doesn't need any introduction. He's the CTO at Domos, and he's going to talk to you today about why latency matters. Magnus, over to yourself, my friend. Yeah.
Hope you can hear me. Great.
We can, yes.
I got that out of the way. Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about latency and latency management and why latency matters, maybe even more than you might think. So like always, I have way too many slides and way too much information, so I'll just jump right to it. So yeah, we talked a bit about what is next for the broadband industry, and certainly parts of it was covered yesterday. Going to 100G PON and so, but there is another side, and it's related to latency in many ways. So we have some struggles and we have some opportunities, and they usually come together. So let me just start with one of the primary struggles that I think every ISP is struggling with, and that is understanding what the end user is actually experiencing. Now, I'm not talking about quality experience because that's a bit muddy. But I'm talking about quality of application outcome, like was Zoom lag free, right? It's really, really hard to tell whether Zoom was lag free from the way we are doing things right now. And one of the reasons for that is because latency under load is increasingly the network quality bottleneck. But we need to get closer to understand quality experience in NPS, right? So that is a challenge and also an opportunity. Then we need to be able to find the true network quality bottlenecks. I know, Scott from AirTies, they know a lot about Wi-Fi, and, it's typically there, but it's not always. And especially around latency, it becomes a bit more challenging. And we need to figure this out to get, make smarter CapEx decisions, do even better troubleshooting, self-help, and customer support. And like this entire session is about, we need some value-added services. How can you differentiate? How can you be not just another internet service provider, but be better and provide something different to the end user? And we believe we can do this with context-aware latency root cause analysis and doing some net neutrality compliant optimization of specific interactive applications. And we can all do this with context-aware latency management. So. And that is deployed on the customer premise equipment. So let me get into it. Okay, so we have some problems. What are the fundamental issues? Why haven't we fixed latency? We've come a long way in increasing bandwidth, but we're still seeing these latency peaks occurring, right? Well, one major issue, and I think maybe the most fundamental, is there is no immediate business case for reducing it. We have a lot of clever engineers, but we're not really getting the money and the investments to solve these problems. And that's primarily because end users think of network quality as megabits per second exclusively. But latency is becoming the network quality bottleneck. And I have a gig symmetrical and latest greatest Wi-Fi. And I still occasionally have troubles with video conferencing, which requires 4 megabits per second. How it shouldn't be possible, right? But it is. And another fundamental issue is that our network quality metrics and frameworks fail to capture this quality of application outcome. How good did Zoom lag or did it not? And the end-to-end root causes. And another thing is, like, we are consistently doing apple to oranges comparisons. We need to get to apples comparisons. Some proof points. I don't know. I'm not sure if I need to go through this anymore, but variable latency is what kills interactive applications. Of course, you need bandwidth, you need sufficient bandwidth, but that is typically not the biggest problem, at least in industrialized countries. And the Broadband Internet Technical Advisory Group just released a great report, 50 pages, just going through this in detail and showing that working latency is the actual problems for interactive applications, such as video conferencing, such as cloud gaming, online gaming, and certainly will be even more challenging with interactive AR and VR and the metaverse and whatnot, right? And this is just fundamental because it's caused by queues, which are caused by overfilling, which are caused by the foundational internet protocols, right? It's TCP, it's QUIC, it's BBR. All of these seek to reach saturation point, right? So they seek to maximize their own bandwidth and therefore create latency. And yeah, our network quality metrics are insufficient, right? There are, say, two paradigms for network quality measurements. One, you have this end-to-end speed test. We all know this, right? You get a speed test number, you get megabits per second, maybe a latency value. And in the middle, there's just a black box of the network. Then on the other side, you have this technology-specific scoring, theoretical throughputs, proprietary scores, right? Which gives you, say, a bottom-up analysis, like, for example, a Wi-Fi or a DOCSIS or a PON or whatever, but these don't add up. You can't take your Wi-Fi score and your DOCSIS score and add them up to figure out what is the problem or what is the end-to-end quality. So these two paradigms are disconnected. Second problem is, here's an meta horizon, right? You can have identical throughput, average latency, jitter, and packet loss, and have scenario A have a good outcome and scenario B have a bad outcome, right? So if you look at the typical 4 dimensions of network quality, bandwidth, average latency, jitter, and packet loss, it is insufficient to capture, will meta horizon worlds lag or will it not? We're just missing some important information here, okay? And all of this is because it doesn't capture how the latency distributes, which is a key part to how applications adapt to network. Okay, so let's get into the solution here. Talked a bit about the problem space, so let's get into the solution. So big shout out to Broadband Forum and TR452, or Quality Experience Delivered, which is a mathematical framework for network quality. Like for us at Domos, this is kind of the foundation of everything we do. It statistically combines all the dimensions of network quality, right? So that is packet loss, that is jitter, that is average latency or median latency and whatnot, and bandwidth. So how does it work? So you can think of it like this, right? For any link, network quality always decreases. Like it's better to have one less link, all things equal, than to have one more, right? But the question is how much does it decrease? So QED or TR452 looks at network quality as latency distribution, or at the TCP IP link. So essentially it's like asking the question, how much does this link or router or hop add latency? How does it add latency? And it looks at that as latency distribution with a probability of packet loss at an observed load. So that's one thing. Like we're not quite getting why that's important, but I'll get to it, I promise. Then application requirements. You can have these very sophisticated application requirements in the same framework and do some calculations, which I will also get to. But the great thing about having this as a latency distribution is that we get this framework of statistics that we can work in. And that means we can add multiple links or subtract multiple links and still have a sensible outcome. You see, when you take a speed test on the Wi-Fi, for example, and you take the same speed test or another speed test on the Axis, you can't just add those up together. It doesn't make statistical sense, right? But if you look at this as latency distribution, it does. And that also gives us statistical tools to look at, hey, we have noise sources, we don't have perfect ways of measuring network quality. So we can adjust for that and give them confidence intervals and whatnot, right? And then we can separate latency that is caused from variability to just a fixed latency of the medium. So we kind of define this quality of outcome. I talked a bit about quality of application outcome, right? So why do we have this? Well, on the one hand, you have quality of service, it's latency, jitter, bandwidth, packet loss, which is unrelatable for end user. And it's multidimensional. It's really hard to optimize for 4 dimensions. It's like if you increase bandwidth, but also increase jitter, did it get better? You don't know, right? On the other hand, you have quality of experience, which is subjective, contextual, changing, right? It depends. It depends on the person. It depends on, what their latest experience was and whatnot. So in the middle here, we're trying to define equality of outcome. What is the likelihood of lag-free zoom? What is the likelihood of eSport quality Fortnite, right? Which we think is both relatable, or at least to a certain extent, right? It's measurable and objective. So it's a good middle ground in many ways. And we use QED to calculate these probabilities. So essentially, we look at near or end-to-end measured latency distribution. Then you can have the sophisticated service requirements, which are essentially a list of, I need 99% of the packets to arrive within 100 milliseconds and 99.99 to arrive within 200 milliseconds, so like that. Then you can calculate this, do a bit of probability and integration, and get to this probability of a good or bad outcome. So, right, so you have a scoring from 0 to 100, where 100 is you're guaranteed this will have a perfect outcome on this network, or at least it's not a network that makes the application suffer. Or you have the other side, it's completely useless. There is no chance that online gaming or AR, VR will work at this network. Okay, so is latency enough? Yes. It is complete. Insufficient bandwidth will cause latency. Packet loss can be seen as infinite latency. If we capture latency as a distribution, we have jitter, peak, latencies, everything, right? It is truly, the one network quality metric to rule them all. It is also independent of OSI layer or any network technology. You can always ask, how does this link or network layer add latency? And it's the same question everywhere, right? And there's a key insight here, that it is impossible to get poor application outcome due to the network without latency spike occurring, right? If an application are not getting sufficient bandwidth, it will try first, there will be a spike in latency. So if there hasn't been any spike in latency, you are guaranteed that the end user has not suffered from poor network quality. Okay, so how do we do this in practice? Well, Domus makes customer premise-based, RG-based, typically Wi-Fi access point-based software that sits there and monitors and probes latency, both on the in-homes, that's the Wi-Fi side, or Ethernet, and also the access and core. Then we do fixed root cause. Then we do root cause analysis on each step, right? So how is latency being added on the in-home? How is it being added on the core and on the access? We do this by combining latency sources such as TCP/SYNAP round trip times, DNF lookup captures. We use ping and ping2 for Wi-Fi, which removes noise from sleeping devices, and then we can use TVAMP Lite or STAMP to probe specific locations either in the access or the core network, and then we do a bit of trace routing as well. Put this all into QED, the QED framework, which let us add and subtract and adjust for noisy measurements. We use a bit of machine learning actually, because Wi-Fi is a bit more tricky and you can't go around probe end user devices all the time. So we take radio conditions into account, and then we do a small feed forward neural network to estimate how the Wi-Fi is adding latency distributions. And then we do this quality of outcome analysis. How is this end-to-end network for gaming? How is it for video streaming, for video conferencing, and now we're adding AR and VR as well. Then we can put these applications, or we have an open source version that you can put in your access or core network, or even into your web apps or end user app. for probing. The goal is to understand the latency contribution of every hop in your network and the quality outcome for every path. And essentially, you go from these two separate paradigms where end-to-end speed test and technology specifics to a X-ray, where you can say, hey, this is how the home adds latency, or this is how the access adds latency, or core, or all the way to the server. And here's the end-to-end quality. And then we do a bit more because we add a bit of context to it. So we have this latency management all running on the CP closed loop in real time. Then we also have a QoS class classifications, right? So we recognize flows of traffic, and we classify what type of traffic there are based on their packet sizes, frequencies, and patterns, right? So we are able to detect video conferencing, video streaming, online and cloud gaming, and now working on AR and VR as well, but just looking at how the traffic works. How often it sends data, how much data up and down, and the pattern. Then we can use this for a net neutrality compliant optimization because it falls under reasonable traffic management, which means we can use the existing QoS mechanism to actually mark traffic and vastly reduce latency. And the output you can see here on the right is like, hey, we've detected some VR, it has a poor outcome, it has a high probability of a poor outcome, so it needs less jitter. Hey, we can actually make this great by using WMM and DHCP. And I see I'm running out of time here, so it has some use cases. We could use user trends, end-to-end network quality, where are the latency root causes being. We have something we call the Taylor network, which lets you set your home into different modes and get this great feedback for each end user device. What is the network quality? What is the likelihood of video conferencing being great, or online gaming, or video streaming? And we have this latency root cause analysis that can be integrated into anything. It is delivered as an SDK from us. One example is this SDK with a latency root cause analysis into Microsoft Teams. So you can have it as a plugin there. And we have a dashboard for gaming as well. Okay, I'm out of time and out of words. Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend the Q&A later. But any questions, you can either put them in the chat, and I'm sure Craig will send them my way, or you can send it to magnus@domos.no. And then, one of the greatest CP manufacturers here, Keon and Carlos Santos, where we are integrated as a containerized application, is ready to speak next.
Magnus, I don't believe you're ever out of words. And just as another shameless plug to base events, we are going to be holding on the 31st of May, so just next week or 2 weeks time, as well as another follow-on webinar on the 2nd of June, I believe, dedicated webinars in regards to latency. We've got a really high caliber panel, including Magnus. So please look out for your invites. We will be doing a couple of webinars dedicated to latency. So please look out for that and join us both on the 31st of May and 2nd of June for that. Right, I'm now going to quickly pass over to Carlos. Carlos, just like Magnus, is a big supporter of our base events. He's the executive head of products now. Sounds very posh, Carlos. At K on Broadband, and he's going to be focusing on security and recognizing the risks introduced by third-party libraries.
Thank
Carlos.
you. Thank you, Craig. Thanks also, Magnus, for the introduction. And once again, thank you for BBF for supporting our participation, and also welcome to everyone joining the session today. So as Craig was introducing, taking the hot potato to address one of the, because we have been discussing, and I think 2021, we have been addressing a lot in terms of, monetization and how also operators, can use the hardware platforms to monetize, introduce services, that are focused obviously to the customer demand. today we will be addressing one specific item, which is related to security, right? So obviously we will be addressing from a CP point of view, and we will be focusing on the USP side, lifecycle management introduced by the framework of Linux containerization. So without further delays, okay, so starting with actually the picture of, you know, the session from 2 weeks ago, right? So, you know, just to set up the scene, we will be addressing here the CP side, right? So, you know, two elements always on this USP and the remote management part for this end-to-end service orchestration. Yeah, so you have what we call the hyperscalers, and, you know, in the previous sessions, we have been addressing those. We will not touch that. Of course, you know, security is also important in terms of, you know, how these containers are deployed and, you know, hosted in this controller side. But we definitely want to push the conversation more towards the CP, right? So and going there, what we have decided to bring today was pretty much, you know, based on our experience, what we are. So the requirements, the concerns, the questions we are getting from our partners, from our, you know, customers, and, you know, some of them are listed here. Obviously, we could not bring the full list, but we thought that, you know, it makes sense to start the conversation on security, not based on our own vision about it, because, you know, security is always a topic of a lot of, you know, discussions, and most of the times there is not really a clear consensus about it, but we decided to bring what others are thinking about it. Yeah, so let's go through it and explore. And I will use one of these examples to also give you an understanding on what we are doing inside the USP framework, right? So following the industry trends and pretty much the fast deployments of these open source and open standards, you know, these are the questions we have captured, and these are the main concerns we have captured. Huh? So isolation from a container to the host and to the other containers, right? So I think everyone understands here that the core services, the critical services that are running on the CPE side, right? And this can be, you know, IoT devices, sensor networks, teleworking, can be energy automation, can be, you know, simple internet alarms. You know, they cannot be mixed, you know, between others. You know, they cannot share this local network traffic, and we need to guarantee some kind of isolation on this point. Second point, or, you know, second bullets is related to the how each container shares the kernel with the host, right? So question here is, does the kernel needs to be present or mounted inside the container? So is that a yes? Is that a no? We will explore this a little bit later with some specific examples. Third element, which is, you know, one of the most topics that we get on the table always, is related to the container isolation, right? So what does it actually mean, container isolation? So multiple applications that can be run without the risk of them interfering with each other, right? So this is the core of the container isolation. So security-wise, from a security point of view, what we need to make sure is that if the security of one container, and one container can be one service, right, has been compromised, we need to guarantee that the other services, or even the host, which in this case is the CPE, remains unaffected. So this is the key, and this is the essential premise for the success of the deployment of services and containerization. The other point is privileged or unprivileged containers. So what exactly, and how do we define these, right? So what is the default pre-configuration, right? So do we want to give to these servers, to this container, you know, the possibility to run as a root user? Yeah. If that is the case, what are the consequences? Actually, this will be the use case that we will pick up today to explore a little bit further on what areas we can do on the security side of a containerization to improve or at least limit the concerns around privilege versus unprivileged. Other point is related to the processes running inside the same container. right? So is it really a best practice of restricting containers to run as a single process? Is it? So I think this is one of the points that definitely we also need, to address and make sure that everyone understands what could be the consequences about it. Management side, right? So how secure are these operations? Because we keep talking about end-to-end orchestration, deploy, and then users can pretty much operate those containers, create, delete, post, start. The question is, how safe are these operations? Are we, by doing these operations, creating a backdoor? So something that we will also explore today. The other part is remote management, security on the moment to operate the container. So once again, extremely important to address this. So if you look to security, right, from a life cycle management perspective, so LCM already provides, in using here a specific framework, in this case Linux containerization, but we could be talking about Docker, or we could be talking about any other framework for the containerization part. It's pretty much off the shelf, providing already two security layers, right? One is the layer that is protecting, pretty much the operating system, right? So the host system, when we are deploying the services, we are at the same time isolating third-party applications into the containerized environments. So this is something that LXC is already giving you off the shelf. The second part is we are introducing also a layer that protects the user from undesired behaviors, right? So obviously this is a concern from operators because most of the times users don't have a bad intention. Well, from a security point of view, you can dispute me on this, but let's assume that users do not want to do harmful actions on purpose, but rather they might do some actions, maybe ignorance or lack of knowledge, which may be harmful to the device, which may be harmful to the CPE operating systems and the users themselves. So, right. So this is something that LXC is already providing off the shelf. Now, at the end of the day, I think one of the questions we need to answer to is what kind of security does lifecycle management provide? The second one is how do we secure these service orchestration systems, right? So containers by itself, if you look to the definition, will not solve all the security problems. They have as well limitations, right? And what we will do next is explore one of those limitations. And I'm going to pick up one of the examples I just mentioned regarding the privilege versus unprivileged. And let's explore what else can we do to improve the security, right? So this is actually something that is already part of our framework, and we are actually introducing this as part of our solution. So imagine the scenario where you have a container or a service running as a root, right? So that means that between so many can have access to your complete file system, device nodes. It will own the kernel because it will run as as a root. It will have access to your network routing and et cetera, et cetera. If something goes wrong, right, what you want to do first as an operator, obviously, but also as a user, you want to limit the access, right? On the network, on the processes, because if something goes wrong, you don't want something else to be broken, right? You also do not want the service, that is exposing certain APIs starts to do system calls, right? So you need to restrain that. And right now, this is the right moment to explore what else we can do, right? So what kind of, additional added values we can put here. And the question is always, is this always sufficient? Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, right? So point number one is capabilities, right? So when deploying these containers or these services, we must define limits to the capabilities of the system. Please take into consideration that we are not here today to discuss, what are those limits, right? So, I mean, most of the times this is, a partnership between customer and you know, the service provider, but you know, capabilities should be restrained. There is something that you can control without minimizing or without putting at risk the service itself. The second one is related to the kernel namespace, right? There is so much, and you know, people that are familiar with Linux, you know this, right? There is so much to configure, right? Network, PIDs, child PIDs, user namespace, yeah, processes that can be privileged users within its own namespace, you know, root-like privileges. So all of that needs to be assessed every time we deploy a service. Yeah, we need to make sure that there is kind of a framework for this. Third elements that we can also exploit and manage, you know, always thinking about the security side, is resources, right? So we need to implement always and monitor always against abuse of the system, right? And could be simple things as CPU, as RAM. When you deploy, when you act on the service, like, you know, pause, upgrade the service. So all of these needs to be managed, controlled, and ideally, we must build thresholds for container deprecation, right? So in the worst case scenario, if a certain threshold is overcome, the container needs to be stopped or it needs to be deleted, because at that point you are no longer in control, right? So you want to be always in control. The fourth dimension, which we believe it's also one possible way, once again, always take into consideration the customer user experience, is profiles, right? So you can actually introduce specific access control per process. So this is something that we are doing with our partners. I mean, for example, with Domus, Magnus was explaining that. So this is something that it should exist. We need to make sure that this exists, because at the end of the day, you know, the user cannot suffer. So all of these four dimensions are actually, you know, additional elements of improvement in terms of security that you can add on the LXC. But the question is, and in terms of the way forward, right? Can we still make it more secure? Because the story does not end here, right? So can we still make it more secure? And the answer is actually yes, right? So what we have done in the past 10 minutes is to look at from a framework containerization point of view, right? From an LXC point of view, right? And once again, this is just a framework, can be any other framework. But the other way to look into it is through these three variables. The first one is the robustness of the code, right? So we need to avoid poor security coding practices, you know, coding vulnerabilities. We need to make sure that we do pen testing, right? To any code in. And that's why, for example, certifications for USP are key, right? So because it provides you all of that and takes all of that into consideration. Second element are libraries, right? Security of the libraries. Keep in mind that, you know, we have been driving open source, right? But always linked to the standardization. And usually operators, when it comes to the open source, they tend to be a little bit nervous when it comes to security. So we need to find a way to, you know, prevent that concern, right? So things like open source code identifications, vulnerabilities tracking on the open source libraries, third-party code identification, right? So all of this is possible inside this library security. The third element is the hardening of the package, right? And the package can be whatever you imagine, yeah, can be part of a service or can be the service itself. But we need to make sure that, you know, we have implemented mitigations, we have implemented, you know, specific techniques to avoid, you know, hardening. And at the end of the day, we need to do a full validation, right? So the concept in our heads, and this is something that, you know, inside Kaon, we are driving it. And look, we are not the experts, but we are working with partners that are definitely experts in not only in the cybersecurity, but from a security point of view. And the point is always the same. You need always to look for the backdoor, right? And what is the backdoor? right? Why, that is, what prevents security breaches, right? So if you look at, going on the left side of your screen, if you look at from a developer point of view, things like securing source control is not enough. Scanning source code is not enough. Scanning binaries for malware is not enough. There is much more that we need to do in terms of mindset for the security enhancement in terms of what will be the final product. But also when you look to the right side of your screen, we are also giving you the experience we are having when it comes to the security from an operator point of view. Look, most of the times we receive compliance questionnaires. Compliance questionnaires are not protection. This needs to be understood also by the operators, right? Vulnerability scanning does not identify malicious intent. So, some of operators, specifically tier 1 operators, have already these vulnerability scannings, but this is not enough because there is actually no 0-day threats. Security and breach of securities is something that, people, also automated engines are always trying to exploit. So the question is, and once again, the way forward, right? Can we still make it more secure? Well, unfortunately, today we don't have time to go over the conversation, but happy to take questions in the end of the session, and always, available to answer more deep questions. My contact is here. And without further delays, I hand over to Mauricio Fernandez from Axiros. And Mauricio, floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Carlos. Mauricio, if you'd like to share your slides, please do. So Mauricio represents Axiros. He's the MD of operations in LATAM for Axiros. And Axiros themselves are a major supporter of a lot of the work that goes on inside the BBF, especially within the connected home environment. So today, Mauricio is going to talk about how TR-143 for government regulatory entities is important, especially in regards to the regulators are needing to increasingly ensure that service delivery meets contractual obligations. So Mauricio, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. This is Mauricio Fernandez from Axiros Latin America. And today I'm gonna show you a success use case for Tier 143 diagnostics being used for regulatory organizations here in our region in Latin America. This is our agenda for today. With the few time we have, I will be able only to show you the big idea of this solution. So let's start. Which is the motivation? Regulatory organizations required to monitor the quality of services being provided by ISPs in order to guarantee that those ISPs are fulfilling the commitments they made with their customers. In that sense, the regulatory organizations required to define a set of indicators that can measure if the service being provided is according to what those ISPs offered to their customers. Additionally, those indicators should be generic enough to be used in any network access technology and used in any type of equipment independently of the vendor. Finally, if it is required that those diagnostics shouldn't be initiated by humans, so devices should be selected randomly among all the devices base of each ISP, and diagnostics should be triggered automatically. So those indicators listed here are being used since a long time ago by the governments to measure the quality of the ISPs. Initially, the governments, they started with solutions based in probes, but the problem of probes is, first, they are expensive since they require a big effort in the logistics to deploy those probes in all the regions among a country. As you can see, these indicators, download speed, upload speed, latency, jitter, packet loss, and service availability, are a perfect fit for the broadband specification tier 143. After that, those indicators are obtained, it is required that some aggregations must be generated, aggregations based on the access technology, on the ISPs, and by geographic region among a country. And finally, those aggregations, those results should be correlated with the service plans that ISPs committed to provide to their customers, and must be also correlated with those thresholds defined by a government to qualify if a company, if a telco is providing the right quality to their customers. So this is the architecture of a solution, a full tier 143 implementation for this kind of use case. I'm going to start on the right side here. First, we have a central platform in a neutral data center. And inside this data center, we have first some collectors. These collectors are responsible for triggering the diagnostics on the devices or getting the information from the ISPs and collecting the result from the devices. After that, some post-processing servers must generate the aggregations, calculate the indicators, and implement the dashboards for visualization of these indicators. Then we have the network test servers. These are the test servers as defined in the tier 143 implementations. They implement the use cases of traffic generation for the download diagnostic, traffic absorption for the upload diagnostic, packet reflection for the UDP eco test, and also they must implement the diagnostic triggering for the UDP eco test when the server initiated a diagnostic is required. These network test servers are normally deployed in the IXP centers among the country, those locations where every provider puts a router for do traffic interchange, but also some governments allows to deploy these test servers inside the networks of the ISPs. And inside the infrastructure of a provider, first we need a proxy, a tier 69 proxy. This is because most of the providers, they already have an ACS, a tier 69 implementation that they use for service provisioning or monitoring or support use cases. And to not affect those solutions, we need to deploy this proxy. This proxy is in charge of triggering the diagnostic inside the network and collecting the diagnostic results and delivering those results to the central collector, but also they forward all the traffic to the existing ACS to keep in the company the capability of managing their devices as they used to do. And finally, we have in the fixed devices inside, we need, of course, an agent, a tier 69 implementation and tier 143 implementation. And for the mobile networks, for the smartphones, we need an SDK. Since this SDK is not something commonly known in our CWMP world, I'm gonna dive inside the features of this SDK. This SDK is a software component normally delivered as a library that the service providers use to include inside the applications, one of the applications that they already have. The use cases, this SDK should implement, of course, a tier 69 and tier 143 implementations. This SDK must be able to collect the data from the device, data identification data like a device ID, the vendor of the device, the operating system, and also usage data like RAM and CPU being used in a specific moment. It also requires to collect service data, which is the antenna connected, which is the signal strength of such antenna in case that the device is connected through a Wi-Fi connection, which is the quality of that connection, and etc. Then it also should have a troubleshooting use cases. This SDK must be able to collect errors because it's quite common that some diagnostics cannot even start or some of them cannot finalize. And that's something that used to happen very frequently. And it is very useful to have a way to collect that information from the collectors to help the ISPs to explain why in some specific regions they are not being able to obtain the enough amount of diagnostics as required by each government. This SDK must be also capable of obtaining the geolocalization from the GPS inside a smartphone. This is for the aggregation of the region as required. And maybe the most important functionality is that this software component should be able to execute the diagnostics in background mode. That means that the diagnostic must be able to start even when the application is not open, and it must evaluate that the user is not using his services to not disturb him, and the end user must not even realize that his device is being used for such diagnostic. Okay, every government define their own rules for this kind of solution, and those rules are divided in these three set of things. First, they define how a diagnostic must be triggered or when a diagnostic must be triggered. They define conditions for the service. If, for instance, if the service is being used, if a subscriber is watching a movie or using his services, a diagnostic should not be triggered to not disturb that subscriber. They must be evaluated the quality of the connection, the admissibility of the device. Some devices are not allowed to doing those diagnostics for some kind of quality or things like that. There are specific requirements for KPIs. For instance, a diagnostics may be required just 3 measures per user per day, and it's not required to do more than 3. And of course, the availability of the test servers must be also evaluated. Then they define validation rules. Once a diagnostic is completed and the results are obtained, a validation process will double check if the diagnostic is complete, meaning that we have a result for the download diagnostic, for the upload, and I don't know, X amount of UDP eco tests that will enable the solution to calculate latency, jitter, and all the other indicators. The validity of the sample, the consistency of the results, and the admissibility of the end customer. These admissibilities related For instance, if in a mobile service, a subscriber executed that diagnostics when the user was on the road, was moving, and a handover happened that the subscriber changed the antenna during the diagnostic, then that sample should be discarded because it's not a valid result. And finally, also each government define their own aggregation rules. Most of them define they want to have arithmetic medians aggregated by region, by technology access, by service plan, and by service provider, of course. Okay, this is a normal flow for a common tier 1 for 3 diagnostic. I'm gonna go through it because I assume most of you already know how this flow works. But let me point some important things on this flow. Initially, as we already mentioned, the collector should get initial data from the device data and service data, and execute this process that evaluate if that device qualifies for triggering a diagnostics according to the rules that mentioned in the prior slide. Besides that, once a device is qualified to start a diagnostics, initially the collectors should trigger some UDP echo tests against all the possible test servers enabled for a specific ISP, of course. The idea here is that the collectors must define which is the best suitable test server among a list of servers they have, and select the best one, the one that have the best latency and have the availability for starting a diagnostic in that precise minute. And once this server is selected, then the collectors can trigger the diagnostics, wait for the diagnostics complete event, and after that, collect all the results from the devices. And finally, as explained, a different process, it validates if all the results can be used for a KPI generation and calculations, and declare it as valid or declare it as discarded in case that some problem is found among those results. Okay, and final step, once all the post-processing servers generated all the calculations and generated all the indicators, all the KPIs, as you can imagine, this is a big amount of data, huge amount of data, and all that data is normally included in any analytics tool or BI tool platform. Normally, every provider uses their own BI for generating dashboard like these examples you are seeing here. Some countries decide to publish this information online to enable the subscribers to see which is the quality that each provider is providing on each region. And of course, some other countries, they want to have the information only for them, for the regulatory organization, and they use this information to qualify the ISPs, and in some cases define penalties when the subscribers are not accomplishing the commitments that they made to their subscribers. Okay, that's it. Here you have our contact information in case someone wants to have additional information from our solution. And now let's give the ball to Tom to talk us about security. thank you very much to all, everybody. Hope
No,
to
thank you, Mauricio. Great presentation, and also a different angle that we haven't covered before in regards to the regulatory needs. So really appreciate that. Great requirement. I'm now going to pass over to Tom Gaffney, who's going to continue on the trend that we started earlier and focusing on security needs. And this one is very much in partnership with the service provider to simplify the security experience within a fragmented world. Tom, over to yourself.
Thank you very much, Craig, and welcome to everybody to the final slide deck before the Q&A today. Yes, just another quick thanks to Craig and all the team at Broadband Forum for letting us speak here today. My name's Tom, and I work at F-Secure. For those of you that don't know us, we are a cybersecurity company based in Finland, and we have more than 30 years experience providing protection to people in digital lives. And one of the things we do is through our global threat centers is track the kind of events and threats that we see facing today. And we've seen some clear increases, which I'm going to get into when we get through the talk. And what's one of the things that's led those increases is hackers targeting newer devices and new contexts that people exist in. And that makes it complicated for consumers to manage security, and in turn makes it complicated for service providers, which is our main channel to market, and also the wider ecosystem players that serve the connected home. So I'm going to talk about some of the examples, how security is affecting people today, and then also some of the challenges that the industry has and how we go about and fix them. But before I do that, I'm going to start with sharing some consumer insight, because that's our primary audience here that we're trying to protect. One of the things that we've seen is obviously post-pandemic is a very clear shift in behavior. So obviously being indoors for a period of time meant that internet usage rose. But what changed significantly is that has stayed. You know, people have continued to use digital services. We shop, we bank online more, we study online, you know, with streaming services. We're engaging a lot more with digital applications more than we had done before. And that's an obvious consequence of having to use them for a period of time. People have got used to them and now they're sharing. And that in turn makes it a target for criminals. We've seen a very clear increase or spike in security events over the last couple of years. Another aspect to that consumer research we found was people's attitudes towards anxiety and digital anxiety. And by that, I mean concerns about being online. And there's two strands to this one. So digital anxiety comes about, one from your connectivity. Partly that's because, you know, we're all working from home. And if you've got an important presentation to colleagues, bosses, customers, you want to make sure your connectivity works in unusual parts of your house. The second part of it relates to the security. Now, across the board, we saw a quite significant rise in anxiety related to security from customers. But that's more pronounced when it comes to those users who've previously worked in an office. And you can say that's kind of understandable, because in the past, those of us who worked in an office and now have shifted to home, we used to have an IT team or a security team that would take care of the security for us. And now we're working at home using residential routers or residential kit, and with a lot of consumer grade devices in the network which pose potential threats. And these factors together are what make it complicated for consumers to manage, but also provide an opportunity for the criminals who want to target us. And very broadly from the threat landscape, we see kind of four main attack areas that the criminals are going afterwards. So there's the traditional malware, there's identity theft, banking and financial related crime, and then IoT or smart devices. When it comes to malware, the king of malware, and has been for last 5, 6, 7 years, is ransomware. You know, ever since 2015, we had a ransomware variant called Locky, which opened the gates to what it could achieve. And we've had global threats that attacked major corporations like WannaCry and NotPetya. But the interesting shift in this domain is that in the last 2 years, we've seen ransomware being pointed towards small businesses and consumers, as hackers see those as a particular target as well. And within ransomware, there's a subset, a component called an info stealer. And like it sounds like, it's a bit of malware which collects details on your device and also credentials. And that's really important to hackers. We've seen a big spike in that. Secondly, identity theft. Now, identity theft is probably the fastest growing area of all of these particular ones. Identity theft comes about through a couple of reasons. The first one is if your device is infected with a virus, about a third of identity theft comes from hackers being able to skim credentials from your infected laptop or mobile phone. The biggest one, however, is what we call account takeover, which is where the organization that you bank or shop with has their systems compromised, and then the hackers will get your credentials from that. We've got countless high-profile examples. You know, I'm based in the UK. Recently, EasyJet, the airline, was a victim of an account takeover attack. Magellan Health in the Nordics, similarly. And this problem with identity theft is a bit exacerbated because many of us reuse common passwords. And if you reuse passwords and a hacker gets your Gmail account, if you're using the same password and email for your banking or your eBay accounts, then they can use those to spoof and get access to those accounts. The third attack vector we see is banking Trojans. There's a recent example of this we've seen in the last couple of years of a mobile app called FluBot, which targets in particular Android applications. It'll come to your phone looking like it's a delivery message asking you to allow certain permissions, which installs the application, and then it will skim your credentials or try and access your shopping and banking. And then the final one is Iot and Device Hacks, which really exploded in 2016 with Mirai, affecting millions of devices around the globe, and then again opened the door to criminals in what they felt they could do. So they could see IoT devices, which typically in the past have had very poor security profiles, were a good target because many of them are out there with default or no passwords, open ports, these kind of things that make it easy. It is true to say recently this is improving, particularly in Europe and in the US, where standards are kind of forcing responsible manufacturers to apply basic security standards, but consumers can buy these goods from anywhere around the world, and the same standards don't apply there. So all of these things mean that there's a kind of panoply of different threats that affect consumers. And to sort of understand the impact, it's good to sort of consider a user in their home. So in the past, we'd be sort of sat at home using a laptop or a mobile phone or perhaps a tablet. And the only security options we had there were endpoint, which are pretty good. You know, F-Secure and a bunch of other competitors all make solutions that will affect that. But then we have all of the electronic goods which now have connectivity and are smart or IoT goods, your connected TVs, digital assistants, door entry systems, and then quite funky white good appliances like kettles, toasters, fridges are increasingly connected to the community. And then we have a context of when users travel, so when they want to go, or when kids are out and about. And kids, of course, have their own threat profile. We want to protect them from harmful content. And then, as I've already mentioned, there's identity. Now, how does a consumer protect themselves? There are various solutions out there, but they're kind of complicated. It's difficult for a consumer to be able to understand which is the right one, because consumers don't think about devices specifically. They're just thinking about their lives, of course. Now, from an secure perspective, we came at this with the angle of two services. One we have is called Total, which is an endpoint application which provides identity protection, anti-malware, banking protection, and family protection. And then we have a product we call Sense, which is the embedded SDK that sits on a router and provides protection for the family inside the house. And we're super proud of these products. They work pretty good, but we can't pat ourselves on the back because they're not the only solutions, or they don't work in every context. And what I mean by that is service providers and the wider ecosystem have other trends which are pushing them in a bit of a different direction. And some of those drivers include major operators who are trying to provide a level of convergence. So led by the big guns, you can think of Liberty Global and their Connect app, and Comcast with the Xfinity application. They're trying to provide all of the services they can, both security, billing, support, entertainment, through a single user interface, because they want to try and limit the number of touch points they have with their customers. But they also want to be able to secure best of breed partners, which means they need to integrate multiple different entities into that single application. Whereas at the same time, somewhat conflicting, they want simplicity. And this is a thing that I think will affect everybody here, whether you're an operator or whether you serve an operator, is we all understand that there are challenges on their resourcing. both from a perspective of delivering new services, but also how much face time they get with customers to promote those services. So integrated apps are a natural direction for operators to step into to try and kind of simplify the experience. But there's another kind of factor here as well, which is communication providers need to deal with a huge range of different vendors in the ecosystem world. You know, primarily through the manufacturer, they'll be delivering gateways provided by people like Carlos and Kaon, and multiple other vendors as well. But then there's also Wi-Fi management to minimize support calls. They need to be able to manage those devices, so they have to engage with ACS remote management vendors. And then there's other edge players who provide value in terms of gaming or motion control. All these kind of elements play here. And the complexity here for the operator is that they're trying to deliver, you know, ultimately the best experience they can, but they're having to work with multiple players across that ecosystem. And that's what makes it complex for them, because like we said, they have limited estate to deliver projects. Now, we've seen some players in the ecosystem market kind of lead with, you know, providing everything as a platform. You know, Plume, notably, Soft at Home are examples of companies who are moving in that direction. And while it's a good approach, it does kind of lock operators into a closed platform, because they've always got to get their services, everything they do has got to come through those providers. I think that we need to kind of look at it in a different direction. So how do we facilitate a best of breed solution for everything that communication service providers need in the simplest and most effective way that we can? So for us, this means looking at our security services in a different way and decoupling, you know, from the sort of one application approach that we take, which, well, we're not going to throw it away because it works very well for some providers. But in other contexts, we're looking at embedded security. And that means to us separating out some of our assets and making them available to everybody in the ecosystem and to operator partners to offer as distinct services. So we're looking at offering SDKs for our core antivirus product, which is called Ultralight. It's the antivirus component which powers the award-winning Total products that we provide for endpoint protection. Then we have VPN, which offers protection when you're moving off net, and also provides some good control in iOS applications. It allows you to be able to do control of applications in a way that Apple approve of. And then the Sense SDK, which is the router embedded service as well. And they're augmented by API-based services. So we have a security cloud. So if you, for example, want to send URLs or files for analysis, you can do that from a router, or you can do it from, you know, Wi-Fi management platform. You can send and pass these things to check it and make sure that wherever the customer is trying to browse to is a safe place. And then the final API we have here is the ID protection one, which again allows you to be able to, you know, share personal information such as email addresses, mobile phone numbers, and all the other PIIs that exist today. And F-Secure can do the work in the background to check and see that those aren't being used by criminals in various contexts. So together, we think that the embedded security approach offers an opportunity for telcos to build these kind of services into their one app approach, but also importantly for anybody in the ecosystem who's looking at adding more value to the core offering that they have and simplifying the overall delivery process to operators. So for my final slide, I mean, to close, for us, we don't see ourselves being anything other than a security company. It's absolutely our purpose and our mission to strive to keep people safe and protected online. But we also have to be cognizant that we are not always the first choice or the only provider that operators are going to deal with. They're going to deal with everybody in the ecosystem. And what we mean or think by enabled embedded security here is opening that up to other ecosystem players to make it part of their proposition. And if that's of interest to anybody, we'd love to hear from you. You can find my details through the Broadband Forum and the usual social media channels. And I'd just like to say thanks very much to Broadband Forum again for letting me speak.
No, Tom, it's always a pleasure to have you speak. And I found that fascinating, not just the simplicity, but the embedded point of view across the whole ecosystem, the gateway vendors, the software vendors, as well as a service container from a service provider. Yeah, quite enlightening, especially for somebody who probably overspends with security because I don't know enough. Okay, let's move to a Q&A session now. And thank you very much for everyone that's put questions in the Q&A box. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate. We are monitoring that, so we'll be reviewing that on a regular basis to include your questions in this Q&A. Okay, let's move straight into it. I've got a question here for Carlos. What could be the basic recommendations, or what would be your basic recommendations when it comes to security and securing the containers that you give in your platforms?
Thanks, Craig. So complex question, right? Because there's different, as we try to expose in the presentation, right? There's different angles to look into security, and obviously there is still some quite big margin, in terms of what you can or you should do, right? But some basic principles could follow the statement like, all containers should be managed, by a designated user with a certain set of privileges, right? So only a specific set of hosts, or the host, in this case, the CPE, might be available, or exposed to the container. So this is, for example, one way of doing it. In addition to that, things like container management software, pretty much, focusing on group of applications for pretty much monitoring the status of the container, health and actions, looking here a little bit towards the USP and, what we can achieve with the controller. On the host, this can definitely, impose additional security measurements, right? Which obviously are already, added by, this service orchestration, right? So, I mean, adding these additional layers of monitoring, and I think today we discussed a lot about it. Mauricio mentioned it, and Tom was also touching a little bit on it. These monitoring and these acting methods that we are all pushing forward, right? As as a unique standardization can definitely drive, what we call the basic recommendations, right? Because at the end of the day, there are basic recommendations, and it's a little bit up to the final customer or to the operator to really have a final word about it. So this will be our view.
No, it's not a one-stop solution, is it? There's many parts to this. So no, interesting, and thank you for that. Question for Mauricio here. You talked about service availability. How is that measured?
Service availability. So we use the UDP eco test to do continuous evaluation over the devices. We have suggestions for the government to improve that, because a device online cannot guarantee that the service is available for the end subscribers. They may have other kind of problems like DNS resolution, naming resolution, or routing, or that kind of things. But normally nowadays, all the governments require just a simple ping or UDP eco test against the devices, but with much more frequency than the other diagnostics. So what we are doing is on the fixed services, we are collecting these diagnostics every 30 minutes normally, but the service availability is measured normally once every 5 minutes.
Okay. So
every day, a subset of devices are selected randomly from a base of ISP in a specific region, and that set of devices change every day.
Thank you. Tom, I've got a question for you here. This is possibly one you haven't had a chance to read, so I'll just throw it at you and see how you cope. We had earlier a presentation by Airties who talked about how the employer is willing now to subsidize the broadband connection for a consumer who works from home for some of the time. Is there a security opportunity here when you're now looking at two different customers in a way? One wearing his home working hat and one wearing his consumer hat. And how do you appease the employer who probably has greater security requirements than the consumer?
Hey, that's a great question. Well, first of all, there is a clear opportunity where the security is being provided. So, it's especially for the home environment, because the devices that you get from your employer are going to be locked down somehow. So, most of us have got VPN. We're using the various corporate tools around that, and to varying degrees, the corporate entity will monitor and manage the security on those devices. And guess most people here, if you're a Windows user like me, you're familiar with the forced updates when security is coming. So that one, I guess they should have that really kind of locked down. The opportunity and let's say the risk comes from the other connected home devices that we have. So, a notorious culprit in the IoT world is the cameras, remote cameras and baby monitors and printers as well. These are high profile attack targets for criminals. And those kind of devices for sure pose a threat to the rest of the network. Even if your core device is protected, what hackers are looking for is a way somehow into the network. What we've seen for many years in the corporate world is hackers will kind of always try to find a hold into the network. They'll find the open door, the weak spot, that's something that lets them deploy something into the network that allows them to sniff, probe, understand what better is happening on the network, which in this case, I guess we can call the home or the WAN. And in that context, there's a clear vulnerability that comes from the other devices, because those threats can spread across even to the work device. So there's a clear opportunity there for everybody in the industry really to be able to sort of make sure that there's an element of protection that applies beyond just the corporate device itself.
And I guess when you're talking about simplicity, it's also educating the subscriber as much as offering the service itself.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I could talk about this quite a lot. I mean, education is essential. We're all it happens necessarily. You can also be somewhat controversial and say, we have education all the time and people don't really pay attention. Now, if it is your company that's delivering the education and what your security policies are, that's fine. That tends to be mandatory and we learn from it. But you talk to my brother, my sister, my parents, their eyes glaze over and they forget about it. So there's only so far that education can take us. Something mandatory. I much more prefer, sort of in the corporate world, we see a sort of gamification of tools, things like, sending phishing emails and trying to trick people into opening them. But that's a harder thing to do in the consumer world.
Yeah. Carlos, quick question for you. You mentioned better control for operators. Could you be a little bit more specific, is the question here?
I can try. I'll do my best. So control in the sense of, making sure that these additional third-party services, and I'm just putting your question into the context where I mentioned it, right?
Yeah.
On the sense where, whatever service we are deploying, whatever, activity we are putting on top of this middleware, right, on this application store or, whatever you want to call it, we need to make sure that if something, goes wrong, and this is always a possibility, right? Services are not flawless. We need to make sure that we always have a way to be in control of the system, right? So this is why, I mean, when we mention, things like control the capabilities and define the limits of the system, right? When we mention things like, define specific rules for the resources, when we mention about specified profiles, specific profiles, access control per process. So this is what I meant in terms of being in control, because this is something that, obviously operators can do as part of their technical specifications. However, we need to see, when it comes to the big picture, which is we need to find in the, between all of us, a framework where this doesn't become, a pick and choose, right? It becomes, a standard framework, something that, when we implement and we go towards this path, it's applicable to all and not just for some, right? So, and obviously this touches a lot the concerns, and, we have exposed some of the concerns from the partners and the operators we are working with, and you will see a common denominator there, which is how do I control this? How do I make sure that, I put it in, I have 1 million devices in the field, and now I need to take it out, right? So
Yeah.
looking simply to that point of view, right? So honestly, we don't have an answer, but we have a way to limit or at least provide additional control, and actually, maybe this is not the best word, but at least give a little bit more of confidence in terms of what can or cannot be done to manage the services.
And I guess that confidence isn't just for the operator offering the containerization of services, but for other third-party partners who want to run their services across that service store, as you call it, or whatever, so that you're assuring not just your own integrity as a network operator, but the integrity of other services to be run across that in a containerized fashion.
Yeah, definitely. Let me take an example, if you give me just 30 seconds. So let's take the example of, Tom, F-Secure cybersecurity, right? So the pace, and Tom, you can correct me here, yeah? But the pace you need to release new softwares to make sure that your cybersecurity concept, right, and the framework where you guys are operating, your pace is quite fast, right? So you need to be able also to provide, that fast pace into a deployment scenario. And here we are entering into the operator's world, right? Where usually, changes on the software of the CPs or pieces of the software are, really big monsters in terms of, certification, proof of concepts, first of all, right? Trials. So this is another example where for the partners, for the for the third-party service providers, you need to be in control. Yeah, you need to find a way to manage your service and what the service is doing and how that service collaborate with the CP or the host system. Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree with that. We are, as a software company, tend to be, let's say, a little bit more dynamic than the operator partners are. So if we want to do bug fixes, releases, or even add new features, yeah, we need to be able to update that firmware somewhere. And yeah, the container environment brings a lot of advantages, because if it's embedded into the native firmware, then we're kind of somewhat restricted to when the whole firmware is updated. So if you can be independently done by a container, that's a huge advantage.
Your business model relies on it, Tom, yeah?
I wouldn't say it kind of relies on it. It just makes life a lot easier.
Yeah, okay. Maurizio, I'm going to throw a question at you that you also probably aren't prepared for. It's a personal question. I talked to a limited number of regulators, especially in Europe, and the trends that I'm seeing from some of them, not all of them, is to have better guidelines, diagnostic and triggers for things like latency and jitter performance or the home Wi-Fi performance. Are there any trends that you're seeing across regions, across continents, more than just the onesie twosie conversations that I have with regulators, if that makes sense?
Well, okay, so that have two different components, two different parts of this. For one side, some governments want to calculate all those indicators with defining boundaries outside the country itself. We personally do not agree on that. We understand that end users, they must have the best quality for using their services, but it is not only if you find a subscriber that doesn't have a good quality for watching Disney Plus, for instance, who will you blame? You will blame the ISP. Maybe you need to blame the owner of the submarine fiber that connects Latin America with the USA. You may blame the data centers in USA that stores the cache system for such kind of services. We don't know who to blame. So when we are talking about regulatory solutions, we believe that we must measure the quality that a specific ISP is provided within their network. And of course, it is information valuable for the government, but should not be used for penalize the service providers. And the second component is, what about migrating this to other regions like Europe, for instance, these kind of solutions. And as far as I know, Europe is still the official regulatory laws and specifications are still being done with props. I don't know why. I really don't understand why, or at least the best or the most known providers for these props, they have a big base of countries over there in Europe. FCC in the USA started like a couple of years ago. They included Tier 143 as an option, and they actually recommend as the best option for doing this kind of diagnostics. But in the USA is different. Each ISP is able to do their own diagnostics in a way that they decide by themselves, and they just need to provide the results to FCC. But I don't know, you should get me a meeting with those who regulate over there in Europe. I promise.
And from a LATAM perspective?
Oh, in LATAM, we have already 4 countries going in these directions, and the biggest ones, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Mexico, and we know that Colombia and Argentina are also preparing the laws. This is a very long process because the government needs to do a law, and of course that takes time. They need to agree. Politicians needs to understand all this technology and needs to approve a law where all this specification is included. But Brazil is the one who started first. We are providing this solution like during the last 6 years already. And the other countries are starting this year. And we know, as I said, that the others are preparing for this kind of solution.
Sounds to me like the BBF has some education work with regulators across the world around TR143. Thanks for that. One final question here for Tom. What are the main challenges for operators face when they're trying to deploy new services, and how can we mitigate these?
Wow, I mean, the challenges are kind of immense, right? So everybody here knows that they're conflicted between their desire to improve the services they offer versus, the desire to generate revenue. And then there's kind of trends which drive them as well. Obviously, the hot topic at the minute for many operators is delivering Wi-Fi 6 out. And, there's been challenges the last couple of years with the supply chain with them being able to meet those requirements. But now the first few operators are doing it, they're all trying to follow on as well. So that they're kind of, as I see it anyway, at least they're sort of caught between the two stools of, optimizing and improving and adding new service versus making new revenue. And in every instance, they have limited numbers of personnel and limited ability to adapt their systems to support new services. So I guess the challenges are kind of manifold, right? And I'm sure people on this could add many more into those as well. In terms of mitigating it, I do, it maybe harks back a little bit to what I was talking about, but in terms of, we're starting to see a lot more collaboration, I think, between different players in this ecosystem about how we bring services to the operators and how we simplify the delivery for them by, not necessarily moving into other areas. Like, for example, we're not moving into Wi-Fi management. We're never going to be a router vendor, these kind of things, but allowing our security services to be deployed in these environments. And yeah, I can see the same, especially, Wi-Fi. I think that's quite a big topic. Lots of different vendors there that are supporting multiple players to get to the operator. I think that's the best bet we have.
So I guess, Carlos, it comes back to the point that you were making, that open standards are really important when you're looking at a multiplayer ecosystem coming together into this service store type environment.
Yeah, and absolutely, Craig. And on top of that, right? I mean, as Tom is saying, we are seeing more and more collaboration, and collaboration inside these partnerships is what will bring scalability, right? And the scalability is very much important for everything that we are doing here inside BBF, which is related to the standardization. No scale, standardization has no value, but if there is scale, then the added value is there, right? So it all goes together. So it's always good to be in sync with all the partners.
No, and we appreciate all three of you and your company's support of the open standards work that we do. So it's great to be part of this evolution. So that ends the Q&A. We're at our timing now. I want to just thank all of our speakers today, Carlos, Tom, Mauricio, and also Magnus for this session too. Great session. I found it really informative. Hopefully you as an audience have as well. Thank you very much, gentlemen. All it leaves me to do now is to thank our sponsors once again. You see them here on the slide. It's down to them that make these events, and their sponsorship makes it a free to attend for yourselves. Thank you very much.